A black belt fighter jokingly challenged the black janitor to spar, and what happened next left the entire dojo in stunned silence. "Hey, janitor, what do you say to a little spar?" Daniel Mitchell bellowed from the center of the tatami, his black belt gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the gym. "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, have you?" Brandon Lewis paused mid-mop and slowly lifted his head. At 42, he'd only been cleaning this gym for 3 weeks, always arriving at night after classes had let out. But that Thursday evening, the advanced session had run longer than usual. Brandon set the mop aside and looked Daniel squarely in the eye, his face calm as ever. A flicker of annoyance crossed his gaze, but he masked it almost instantly. In a measured, polite tone, he replied, "Sorry, I don't want to interrupt your training. I'm just finishing up my work here." Daniel threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing through the hall. Turning to the students, he staged a little performance. "Look at this. Our janitor friend over here is too scared to step up. I'll bet he's never even set foot on a fighting mat." Murmurs rose among the students. Some snickered, others shifted uncomfortably. Everyone sensed Daniel's cruelty, but no one dared speak up for Brandon. Silently, Brandon picked up his mop again, avoiding everyone's gaze as he continued working. But Daniel wasn't done. He swaggered closer, his voice dropping to a sneer. "Come on, don't be shy. I promise I'll go easy. Just show these students the difference between someone who really trains and someone who just cleans the floor. It's all in good fun." A few students exchanged uneasy looks. Some forced laughs tinkled in the air, as if to break the mounting tension. Brandon gripped the mop handle tighter and took a deeper breath. He bowed his head for a moment, swallowing the emotions rising inside him. He had vowed never to return to the ring, had hidden his true identity for 20 years. He thought of the peaceful life he'd built, of the years he'd spent trying to bury the past. Then, lifting his eyes to Daniel once more, he spoke softly but with steel in his voice. "I really don't want to bother you. Please respect my work and carry on with your training." Daniel's brow furrowed. He felt a sting to his pride at being so flatly refused. His arrogance pricked. He raised his voice even more, determined to provoke Brandon. "Oh, you're serious? How disappointing. I thought we'd get a good show. Didn't you ever step onto a real fighting mat?" Brandon said nothing, returning to his mopping as though he'd heard nothing. But deep inside, memories of brutal matches, of glory and of agony began to surface. His chest tightened as he recalled that fateful fight, the final bout of his career. Unperturbed, Daniel continued to taunt and jeer, relishing Brandon's silence. Several students watched, curious to see if Brandon would finally snap back. His quiet endurance drew some sympathy, yet no one dared intervene. At last, Daniel crossed his arms, looked Brandon up and down with contempt, and addressed the students in a loud, condescending tone. "See that? In martial arts, you need to know your place. Some of us are born to be fighters, others are just meant to clean the floors. I hope you all understand that now." Daniel's cutting words echoed in Brandon's mind. He bowed his head lower, swallowing his anger and pain. He knew that if he let himself get drawn in, the old wounds would reopen and haunt him once more. What Brandon didn't realize was that the fateful match he'd avoided for 2 decades was beginning to call his name again, and this time, he might not be able to duck the challenge. Daniel Mitchell's arrogant laughter still rang through the gym, though by now Brandon could hardly hear it. He bowed his head lower, eyes fixed on the gleaming floor, but in truth he was peering into a past he had carefully buried for 20 years. Daniel's jeers were like an unexpected key, flinging open Pandora's box of painful memories he'd fought so hard to forget. As Brandon mopped the floor, each measured swipe of the broom seemed to beat in time with his racing heart, guiding him back to vivid images of the life he once led. Who was he, really? What kind of life had he lived before he became just a janitor at this dojo? 20 years ago, the name Silent Storm was legendary across MMA arenas worldwide. In his early 20s, Brandon Lewis had compiled a record that commanded global respect. 5 consecutive world championships, victories over opponents deemed unbeatable. His power, speed, and above all, his cold, unflappable composure in the ring earned him that fateful moniker. In every match, he remained utterly silent and intensely focused, then struck with decisive blows that left adversaries unable to rise. Those were the glory days when fame, fortune, and the world's admiration were his to command. But it all ended in an instant one fateful afternoon during a training session for what would have been his 6th world title bout, an event he had prepared for alongside his best friend, Tony Roberts. Tony wasn't just a teammate. He was the brother Brandon had grown up with in Chicago's toughest neighborhoods. Together, they had escaped poverty, trained side by side, and conquered the harsh world of professional fighting. That afternoon in Las Vegas, the pressure was immense. Tony knew how to steady Brandon, reminding him to stay calm whenever racial taunts or slurs tried to provoke him. But that day, something was different. The insults and taunts from his previous fight, cruel jabs at his skin color, still echoed in his mind, fueling a silent storm of rage. When they stepped onto the mat for a light sparring session, Brandon couldn't control his emotions. Each punch and kick rang out with more force than intended, charged with the anger he'd been suppressing. Tony noticed immediately, urging him to calm down, but it was too late. In a flash of misplaced fury, Brandon threw a devastating punch he never meant to land. Tony's head snapped back, and he collapsed in an awkward heap on the mat. The sickening crack echoed in the sudden silence of the gym, etching itself forever into Brandon's memory. At first, Brandon thought Tony had simply been knocked out, but when his friend lay unmoving, not a single groan escaping him, Brandon realized something far worse had happened. His worst nightmare became reality when the doctor announced Tony had died on the spot from a catastrophic brain injury. It was an unthinkable accident. Although the official investigation declared it a tragic accident, Brandon could not accept that. He knew it was his own momentary loss of control that had taken his brother's life. Ever since, that guilt had weighed on him like a never-ending curse. Brandon walked away from everything immediately after the incident. Titles, career, lights, none of it mattered anymore. He left Las Vegas and drifted from city to city, living a life of anonymity, taking simple jobs to forget the heartbreak. For 2 decades, he guarded his true identity fiercely, hoping those nightmares would never find him again. But today, at Elite Martial Arts, Daniel Mitchell's arrogant, discriminatory challenge had yanked Brandon back into that past. Daniel's cruel taunts mirrored the hateful jeers that had haunted him 20 years ago, the same words that had cost Tony his life. The memory gripped Brandon's heart with fresh pain. He felt a violent tempest stirring within him, one part smoldering rage, the other paralyzing fear that he might lose control again, just as he had on that fatal day. Brandon squeezed the mop handle until his knuckles whitened. He told himself he could never let that mistake happen again. He wouldn't allow the provocations of an arrogant man like Daniel to shatter the peaceful life he'd painstakingly built over 20 years. But deep in his soul, Brandon knew the truth. You can't run from the past forever, and fate, whether he liked it or not, was pulling him back to the one place he never wanted to return. Brandon closed his eyes and drew a deep breath to steady his emotions. All he could do now was hope that this time he'd be strong enough not to lose himself again. Brandon opened his eyes, his breathing slowing back to a steady rhythm. He forced himself to tuck the flood of emotions he'd just released deep inside his chest. But just as he was about to resume his unfinished work, Daniel Mitchell's cold, mocking voice cut through the air again, as if deliberately gouging at the wounds Brandon was trying to soothe. "You there, don't waste our time any longer. Everyone knows people like you have nothing in life but mopping floors. Why are you pretending to be so busy?" His words were like a razor blade against Brandon's pride, each one deliberately aimed to cut him down. Brandon clenched his fist, the muscles in his forearm bulging reflexively, but instantly he reminded himself he could not let his anger control him again. Seeing no reaction, Daniel grew more irritated. He turned back to the students, his eyes sparkling with malice. "Have any of you ever heard a funnier story? A black janitor at a martial arts gym. I couldn't pass up the chance to see this." Several students managed awkward laughs. Others fell silent, casting sympathetic glances at Brandon. The atmosphere in the dojo tightened, as if frozen under Daniel's increasingly brazen provocation. Brandon remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor, yet every muscle in his body was taut with tension. Daniel's racist jabs echoed the taunts Brandon had endured throughout his storied career. He remembered the scornful looks, the jeers, the cruel words from crowds whenever he stepped onto the mat. Still unsatisfied with Brandon's silence, Daniel stepped even closer, only a few feet away, and dropped his voice so everyone could hear. "What's the matter? Too scared to face me? Is it because your skin color makes you feel inferior? Need me to say it more clearly?" A few students gasped at Daniel's audacity and began whispering among themselves. Emily Chen, a top student who admired Daniel, frowned at her coach's disrespectful behavior. Yet her respect for him and her hesitation to speak up kept her and the others frozen in observation. Brandon felt himself teetering on the knife's edge between calm and explosive rage. He knew all too well the consequences of losing control, but Daniel's words insulted him so deeply he could hardly bear it. Each barb was like a whip cracking across his heart, stirring memories he had desperately tried to bury. He took a slow, measured breath, forcing his voice to stay even as he replied, "I just want to finish my job. Please don't make things harder than they have to be." Daniel burst into laughter, eyes blazing with contemptuous challenge. "Harder? You're the one putting on a show here. Do you really think someone like you matters to me? Don't play the victim, Brandon. I'm just teaching you your place." The students shifted uneasily, exchanging worried looks. They wondered how someone they respected so much could behave so cruelly. Yet, Daniel's influence was too great for any of them to stand up for Brandon. Inside, Brandon felt a violent struggle. Half of him wanted to leap into the ring, to teach Daniel a lesson in respect and humility, but the other half, still haunted by that tragic accident years ago, restrained him, warning of the dangers of losing control again. He had spent 20 years running from himself, from the fighter within who had unintentionally taken his best friend's life. He did not want to awaken that man again. Yet now, faced with Daniel's relentless provocation, Brandon knew it would be nearly impossible to keep his composure much longer. Sensing Brandon's rising impatience, Daniel cracked a cold, calculating smile. "I'll say it once more, Brandon. If you have any pride left, step onto the mat, or maybe you don't even have the self. Respect to match your skin color." The dojo fell into a fearful silence. All eyes bore into Brandon, waiting for him to react. Emily clenched her fists, torn with anxiety and sympathy, yet still powerless to speak. At last, Brandon squared his shoulders and met Daniel's gaze for the first time since the confrontation began. In his eyes, you could see a storm brewing, silent but fierce, just like the nickname he once bore, the Silent Storm. "You really want that, Daniel?" Brandon asked, his voice calm but laden with warning. Daniel smirked, challengingly. "Go ahead and try." Brandon said nothing more. He knew he had reached a crossroads he could no longer avoid, and this time neither he nor Daniel could predict what would happen next. The moment Brandon's eyes locked with Daniel's arrogant, challenging stare, he knew the moment he'd been avoiding for 20 years had finally arrived. The air in the gym grew so tense it felt suffocating, like the deathly calm before a raging storm. Daniel spotted the hesitation in Brandon's eyes. A spark of delight lit up his face, the cold, smug grin of a predator who's found his prey's weakness. He decided to take things up a notch. Suddenly, he lunged forward and shoved Brandon hard on the shoulder, sending him stumbling back 2 steps. "Got that, Brandon? I want to fight you right now in front of all these people." Daniel's voice was ice cold, echoing in Brandon's mind. The entire gym froze at Daniel's public challenge. A few students exchanged stunned glances at their coach's out-of bounds behavior. Emily Chen felt anger and discomfort, but like everyone else, she was too intimidated to speak up. Brandon remained still after the shove, his gaze locked on Daniel's satisfied face. Inside him, a fierce internal battle raged. If he didn't respond now, this humiliation would haunt him forever, destroying the dignity he'd rebuilt over the past 2 decades. Yet the nightmare of his past accident still gripped his heart, sending tremors through his body. Daniel stepped closer, his voice carrying so everyone could hear. "See? This is why nobody respects those who spend their lives mopping floors. They're only good at bowing their heads and accepting their fate." That line was another icy blast to Brandon's pride. All eyes, some sympathetic, some curious, some openly contemptuous, were fixed on him, waiting for his reaction. Brandon drew a long, steady breath, knowing in this moment there was no turning back. Gently, he set the mop down. He straightened, facing Daniel head-on. Now, Brandon's eyes burned with an unusual seriousness and resolve, so different from the beaten posture Daniel assumed he'd see. "You want to fight me, Daniel?" Brandon asked, his voice calm but charged with power. "Exactly. Or do you still want to run away?" Daniel sneered, his contempt plain. Brandon held his gaze, then spoke loud enough for every student to hear each word. "Fine, I accept. But before we start, I want you to promise everyone here one thing." Daniel looked momentarily taken aback. The mocking smile froze on his lips at Brandon's unexpected composure. "What do you want?" he asked, hesitating. Brandon's tone was low and steady, full of conviction. "If I win, you will publicly apologize to every student here for your disrespect. You will admit that you turned this serious martial arts gym into a stage for your arrogance and contempt." A ripple of surprised whispers swept through the gym. Students stared at one another, amazed by Brandon's bold, just demand. Emily's eyes widened with admiration. She felt real respect for the janitor in that moment. She understood that his request wasn't just a bargaining chip. It was a declaration of his dignity and self. Respect. Daniel's face flushed, his pride wounded in a way he never saw coming. He'd always stood at the top, revered by his students. Brandon's condition felt like a slap to his own arrogance. Daniel forced a casual smirk. "All right, But mark my words, Brandon, that'll never happen. I'll have you lying on the floor begging forgiveness for wasting our time." Brandon said nothing more, his eyes razor sharp on Daniel. Mixed emotions still roiled within him, but one thing was clear. He could no longer hide who he truly was. To protect his honor, to defend his self-worth, he had to step into the ring, even though it was the last thing he wanted. The gym fell utterly silent. All eyes turned to the two men facing off. Everyone knew this was no ordinary match. It was a battle of pride, of human dignity, a clash between a man accustomed to bullying others and a man who'd once been broken but was now determined to defend his honor. In that moment, Brandon realized he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who'd ever been belittled and insulted, for those too weak to speak up. He had become an unlikely hero, despite never wanting the role. Brandon stepped onto the mat. Each footfall carried the weight of 20 years of memory, inner turmoil, and his unwavering resolve to reclaim his dignity once and for all. As Brandon took firm, measured steps onto the mat, the entire gym fell into an uncanny silence, an almost unnatural calm, like the stillness before a raging storm. Each footfall was barely audible, yet every thud echoed in the minds of the students watching anxiously. In that moment, all eyes were fixed on the man normally seen only with a mop in hand. But now, standing in the center of the ring, his movements utterly defied their expectations. Gone was the submissive, resigned posture. In its place was a stance of confidence, steadiness, and calm. A bearing only forged by hundreds of real fights. Brandon slowly shrugged off his dark blue janitor's jacket, revealing a sculpted physique with well-defined muscles no one had suspected. Faint, pale scars on his shoulders and arms, small though they were, spoke of a past far from ordinary. His eyes now shone with absolute serenity, betraying not a trace of anger, in stark contrast to the emotions roiling within his heart. Across the ring, Daniel Mitchell froze for a heartbeat. His eyes widened in genuine surprise at the professional composure Brandon displayed. This was not the reaction Daniel had counted on. He had expected to see fear, trembling, anything but this steely calm. Instead, he felt the first stirrings of uncertainty he'd experienced all evening. But Daniel's pride surged back. He straightened his black belt, stepped deliberately closer to Brandon to assert his dominance, and cleared his throat, his cold gaze sweeping over his opponent with thinly veiled contempt. "You've surprised me, Brandon, but it's only skin, deep. You think taking off that janitor jacket makes you a fighter?" He sneered, glancing around the gym as if to solidify his unquestioned authority in front of his students. "Look closely, everyone. A janitor trying to don a tough exterior to hide his weakness inside. Don't be fooled. True strength is earned through sweat, tears, and sacrifice, things someone like Brandon could never understand." Daniel's words made many students shift uncomfortably. Some cast questioning looks at Daniel, as his insults revealed the darker side of the man they once admired. Emily Chen clenched her hands in disappointment. She'd never been so disillusioned with an instructor she'd idolized. Yet, like everyone else, she lacked the courage to speak up and defend Brandon from this blatant disrespect. Brandon remained silent, his gaze locked unwaveringly on Daniel's. His cold, unshakable calm startled Daniel once more. Those were the eyes of a man who had stared down danger, challenge, and death, eyes honed only by do or die battles. Determined to regain control, Daniel closed the gap even further, his voice dropping to a menacing growl yet loud enough for all to hear. "Brandon, I'm giving you one last chance. Bow your head and apologize to me right now, then get back to your mopping. This isn't a place for people like you." Brandon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he maintained that steady gaze, past and present, melding in his mind into a swirl of complex emotion. He knew this was more than a physical fight. It was a battle to defend his honor, his worth, and the self. Respect he'd fought to preserve for years. Finally, Brandon spoke, his voice as calm as ever but sharp as a blade. "Daniel, you're right about one thing. True strength is forged with sweat, tears, and sacrifice. But you're gravely mistaken if you think I've never faced those trials. I've fought more than you can imagine, and paid prices you couldn't begin to fathom." His words cut through the stillness, sinking into the minds of everyone present. The students exchanged stunned glances. No one expected such powerful, profound truth to come from the man they only knew as a janitor. Daniel paused, then masked his unease with a haughty laugh. "Fine, Brandon. I hope your fighting skills are as good as your words. But don't say I didn't warn you. Once we're on that mat, I won't hold back." Brandon nodded silently, eyes locked on his opponent. He knew Daniel was an exceptional fighter, but he also understood this fight was about far more than winning or losing. It was about confronting himself, about facing the painful past he'd long tried to forget. Both men stood face to face, breathing evenly, poised for the tense duel ahead. The entire gym seemed to hold its breath, watching every subtle shift, knowing they were about to witness something extraordinary. A clash of arrogance and humility, of past and present, between a man accustomed to domination and an unlikely hero forced to defend his honor. Brandon gently clenched his fist. His eyes now burned with a fierce determination unseen in 20 years. The instant the signal to begin rang out, Daniel surged forward, making no effort to conceal his intent to flatten Brandon as quickly as possible. Each stride was powerful, each swing packed with raw force. Daniel poured every ounce of his fury and arrogance into those opening attacks, determined to prove his superiority before the entire gym. What happened next left everyone watching completely stunned. Brandon, astonishingly calm, moved with effortless grace. His footwork was so light it seemed weightless, causing Daniel's furious punches and kicks to sail harmlessly past him. Blow after blow, devastating strikes and thunderous kicks landed on nothing but empty air. Brandon made no effort to counter. He simply evaded, maintaining perfect distance, as if he could read every one of Daniel's intentions before they happened. A stunned hush fell over the gym as the students realized Brandon was nothing like they'd imagined. His agility and uncanny anticipation left them breathless. It was dawning on them that beneath the humble janitor's uniform stood a genuine martial artist, someone with elite skills even Daniel Mitchell was struggling to cope with. Daniel's initial confidence evaporated. He unleashed stronger, more aggressive attacks, rage and panic etched on his face. With each effortless dodge by Brandon, Daniel's eyes grew wilder, his breathing more frantic. "What's wrong, Daniel?" Brandon called out, voice calm yet razor sharp. "Is this really all you've got to show everyone?" Brandon's words pierced Daniel's wounded pride, nearly sending him off the rails. With a furious roar, Daniel hurled a devastating punch aimed straight at Brandon's face. Yet Brandon merely tilted his head, letting Daniel's fist whistle past just inches from his cheek. Daniel lost his balance and nearly crashed to the mat. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, their astonishment shifting to admiration. Emily Chen watched every movement, noticing that Brandon wasn't just avoiding, he was deliberately drawing out Daniel's unchecked temper for all to see. a sophisticated tactic only a seasoned fighter could execute. Sensing the shifting tide in the student's eyes, Daniel panicked further. He attacked like a feral beast, unleashing a barrage of furious strikes with no thought to strategy. The composure and arrogance he'd begun with vanished, replaced by a face flushed with desperation, eyes clouded by fear and frustration. Brandon remained unflappable, each motion measured and flawless, betraying not a flicker of stress. Daniel's bewilderment turned to fury. No one had ever dared humiliate him this way, especially not in front of his students. Again, Brandon spoke, this time his voice resonating with authority. "Daniel, you should stop before this goes too far. This isn't how a true martial artist behaves. You're only losing the respect of everyone here." Daniel froze, panting, sweat streaming down his brow. Brandon's words were like an icy blast to his wounded ego, but instead of conceding defeat, Daniel's anger flared. His chest heaved with ragged breaths as he fought to cling to the last shred of arrogance left inside him. "Don't act so noble with me. You haven't won yet, Brandon. I won't stop until I take you down." Brandon shook his head, a hint of pity in his gaze for Daniel's blinded stubbornness. "If that's your choice, I'll respect it. But remember your promise. When this fight ends, you must apologize to everyone here." The students felt once more the incredible inner strength radiating from Brandon. They saw in him a man utterly in command of himself, in stark contrast to Daniel's frantic, uncontrolled fury, and they began to realize this was no longer just a fight between two men, but a clash of values, humility versus arrogance. With a roar, Daniel launched one final, reckless strike, a spinning kick powered by every ounce of his skill and strength. But as before, Brandon simply stepped back at the right moment, letting the desperate blow miss. Daniel's rage and exhaustion left him panting, limbs trembling. Brandon stood his ground, meeting Daniel's gaze with composed authority. "Do you see now, Daniel? True strength never comes from arrogance or contempt for others. If you can't control yourself, then all your skills mean nothing." Daniel halted, utterly stunned by the sharp truth in Brandon's words. In that moment, the entire gym seemed to recognize the fight's outcome. Not because Daniel was too weak, but because Brandon had shown them what real strength looks like. Silence pressed in as Daniel, shaking, faced the man he'd assumed would be an easy victory. And Brandon, steady, unwavering, stood tall as if nothing unusual had happened, affirming to every witness that Brandon Lewis, the humble janitor, was anything but ordinary. In that suffocating silence, Brandon stood unmoving, his gaze unwavering on Daniel, who trembled with rage and helplessness. Yet deep in Brandon's calm eyes, an inner storm was building, fierce, chaotic, and more painful than any blow he'd ever taken. Daniel panted, his eyes shining with a mix of despair and fury. He knew his arrogance and reputation were crumbling with every second Brandon held his ground. Fear and loss of control sent Daniel into a panic. He no longer recognized himself. Suddenly, Daniel gritted his teeth and lunged at Brandon with a wild, uncontrolled barrage. Brandon evaded effortlessly, each movement so light and fluid it seemed flawless. But then a dark memory struck him as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. In his mind rang the dry crack of impact and the searing pain. He saw his best friend, Tony Roberts, lying motionless on the cold gym floor, eyes shut, blood pooling beneath him in droplets that reminded Brandon of an unforgivable mistake. The memory was so clear that his chest tightened and his breath grew heavy. On that fateful day, those uncontrolled strikes and emotions had stolen Tony's life, his friend, brother, and teammate. Brandon clenched his fists, panic and guilt surging. He wondered if he was edging toward that same abyss again, if he was about to lose control and unleash a new tragedy. That fear stalled him. His steps faltered, his breathing quickened. He had spent 20 years running from that feeling, refusing to face the risk of losing himself again. Yet here, in the midst of this fight, he felt danger looming, ready to replay the old calamity. The instant Brandon hesitated, Daniel seized the moment. His eyes flashed with opportunity as he unleashed a vicious kick aimed full force at Brandon's chest. The kick nearly landed before Brandon snapped back to focus and managed a small step back. But the distance was too short. The impact still rocked him off balance, and he stumbled. A murmur of astonishment swept through the gym. No one expected Brandon to be so pressured. Daniel laughed like a man possessed and surged forward, launching even more frenzied, savage attacks. Consumed by rage and wounded pride, he fought blind, desperate only to crush Brandon. Meanwhile, Brandon remained lost in inner turmoil. He knew if he lost control again, he could cause another tragedy. Tony's face, eyes vacant, blood on the floor, haunted every breath. Then a shout rang out from the students, shattering the deadly silence. "Brandon, pull yourself together. Don't let him beat you." Startled, Brandon turned toward the voice. It was Emily Chen, her young eyes full of worry and faith. Her earnest call snapped him back. He realized he wasn't fighting just for himself, but for everyone who believed in him and awaited something more. He drew in a deep breath, reminding himself why he'd stepped into the ring. He wasn't here for revenge or to trigger a fresh tragedy. He was here to defend his dignity, to prove that true strength lies not in hatred or losing control, but in confronting the past and mastering oneself. As Brandon centered himself, Daniel kept flailing out powerful strikes, most flying past empty air. But Daniel didn't see that in his rage. He'd lost his mind, while Brandon had found his focus and resolve more fiercely than ever. Brandon calmly dodged another brutal kick, then spoke with solemn authority, his gaze steady. "Daniel, this is my final warning. I don't want to hurt you, but I won't let you hurt anyone else, least of all yourself." Daniel froze, stunned by Brandon's serious, potent words, but wounded pride wouldn't let him relent. He gritted his teeth and readied another attack. Brandon stood firm, knowing he had to end this fight swiftly and safely before everything spiraled out of control. He couldn't afford a misstep. He would not let the past repeat itself. The gym brimmed with tense anticipation as everyone sensed the decisive moment was near. In that instant, Brandon understood he faced the most crucial choice of his life. A decision that would not only decide this match, but shape the man he would become. The moment Brandon resolved to end the fight quickly, lest it spiral into another tragedy, Emily Chen, standing just outside the ring, couldn't take her eyes off him. There was something in his bearing, in the effortless precision of his movements and his absolute calm, that made her wonder, who is this man, really? Driven by curiosity, Emily slipped her phone from her jacket pocket. While everyone else remained glued to the tense action in the ring, she quietly typed the keywords into her search bar. Brandon Lewis MMA Fighter. Her heart skipped as search results popped up on her screen. Emily's eyes widened in astonishment and excitement when she saw photos and profiles detailing a legend of the professional fighting world. She scrolled through article after article, video after video of classic bouts, her fingers trembling when she read the bold headline, "Brandon Lewis, the Silent Storm, undefeated MMA champion, 5-time world title holder." A lightheaded thrill washed over Emily. Her pulse raced as she realized that the mild-mannered janitor she saw every day was in fact one of the greatest legends ever to step into an MMA cage. A fighter renowned for superlative skill, uncanny fight IQ, and the eerie silence that always unnerved his opponents. She lifted her phone and whispered the revelation to the students nearest her. Shock rippled through the gym like an invisible wave. The murmurs grew louder, and every glance cast toward Brandon now brimmed with respect, disbelief, and admiration. "No way," murmured a young student, excitement lighting his face. "He's the Silent Storm? I've watched him fight. He's legendary." "Then why on earth is he working as a janitor here?" another student asked, her voice a mix of awe and concern. Emily could only stare, her heart still pounding, as she watched the match unfold. Now she understood how Brandon had so effortlessly evaded Daniel's strikes and maintained that astonishing composure under fire. He wasn't just any janitor, he was the Silent Storm himself. A man who'd once dominated the MMA world with ruthless precision and unshakable control. On the mat, Daniel finally noticed the shift in the student's demeanor. He glanced over his shoulder and saw every eye fixed on Brandon in awe. Their newfound respect rattled and infuriated him. "What are you all looking at? Who do you think he is? Just a lucky janitor who dodged a few punches," Daniel shouted, desperate to reclaim his fading confidence. But Daniel's arrogance now rang hollow. Emily, no longer able to contain herself, spoke out clearly, her voice cutting through the tense hush. "Daniel, you've got it all wrong. The man standing before you is Brandon Lewis, the Silent Storm, 5-time, undefeated MMA world champion. You're facing a living legend, not some ordinary janitor." Daniel froze, eyes widening in horror and disbelief. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he tried to process the words. He shook his head and forced a strained laugh, trying to mask his unease. "What are you talking about, Emily? That can't be. Brandon is he's just..." "Just what, Daniel?" Brandon's voice rang out softly but with surprising strength, making everyone jump. "Just a janitor? You were wrong. I used to be a fighter with titles, money, and fame, but I lost it all in a moment of lost control." He spoke slowly, every word a piercing arrow aimed at Daniel's conscience, the entire gym falling silent in the powerful stillness. "Daniel, I was once like you, proud and undefeated, thinking I stood above everyone. But it was that very arrogance that drove me to the worst mistake of my life, a mistake I've never been able to forgive myself for. I've spent the last 20 years in hiding, trying to atone for it." Brandon paused, looking out at the students who hung on his every word. "Today, I'm not here to beat you, Daniel. I'm here to prove that true strength doesn't come from arrogance or hatred. It comes from facing your past, accepting your mistakes, and becoming a better person." His words resonated through the gym, touching the hearts of everyone present. Daniel stood frozen, panic, shame, and regret washing over him. He could hardly believe the man he'd just mocked and underestimated was the very legend he'd once admired from afar. Staring at Brandon, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. You really are the Silent Storm?" Brandon gave a quiet nod, his calm gaze tinged with a deep sorrow. "Yes, Daniel. But today, I stand before you not as a champion, but as a man who hopes you'll understand the true meaning of martial arts and self-respect." The gym fell into an emotionally charged silence as everyone realized they were witnessing more than a fight. They were witnessing the rebirth of a legend and a profound lesson in the true nature of strength and honor. The moment Brandon's words trailed off, the gym fell into an almost supernatural stillness. His heartfelt speech had struck not only the minds of every student, but had pierced straight through Daniel Mitchell's proud facade, exposing the deep confusion and fear lurking beneath. But Daniel, long accustomed to masking his weaknesses with soaring pride, refused to yield to the painful truth. His eyes glinted with ruthless defiance. Unable to tolerate public humiliation, he ground his teeth and resolved to unleash one final, desperate strike, an all-out punch fueled by the last embers of his wounded ego. Brandon saw the shift in Daniel's mindset and knew this was the moment to end the fight. Not to prove his own dominance, but to teach Daniel, and everyone watching, an invaluable lesson in true martial arts and genuine humility. With a furious roar, Daniel lunged forward at breakneck speed, hurling himself into a punch more powerful than any he'd thrown before. The entire gym held its breath, every eye fixed on that decisive instant. Daniel's fist hurtled toward Brandon's chest, a last-ditch bid to knock down the man who'd stripped away his pride. Then something extraordinary happened. Brandon didn't step back or frantically dodge as before. Instead, he remained utterly composed. He took a single, calm step to his right, just enough for Daniel's punch to whistle past his shoulder. In that same fluid motion, Brandon pivoted like a gentle breeze and delivered a simple but devastating counter, a subtle sweep at Daniel's center of gravity. In a split second, Daniel realized he'd lost control of his own body. It was as if he'd collided with an immovable steel wall, an invisible force so powerful it sent him flying backward. He sailed through the air, limp and helpless, before crashing to the mat with a thunderous thud. An absolute hush descended over the gym. Daniel lay motionless, staring blankly up at the ceiling. He couldn't comprehend what had just occurred, how a single, unassuming move had utterly undone him in an instant. Every ounce of strength, technique, and arrogance he'd once prided himself on lay shattered. All he could feel now was overwhelming shame and despair. The students, too stunned to speak, watched in awe. None had ever witnessed such a clean, effortless finish. Emily Chen stood rooted to the spot, arms clutching her chest, her eyes wide with reverence and admiration for Brandon's humble yet formidable grace. In that moment, she understood why he was called the Silent Storm. Brandon remained silent, looking down at Daniel with neither triumph nor scorn, only empathy and a profound sorrow at seeing his opponent so thoroughly undone. He stepped forward, bent to one knee, and extended his hand. The gym watched in stunned silence. "Daniel," Brandon said gently, "I hope you understand now. Martial arts isn't a tool to assert superiority or bully others. It's a path to better ourselves and to learn respect for everyone around us." Daniel stared at Brandon's outstretched hand, his eyes still shaking with confusion and remorse. For the first time, he truly felt small and vulnerable before the very man he'd once mocked and belittled. I was wrong," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling and utterly devoid of its former force. "I was completely wrong." Brandon nodded, his hand still held out, his tone both compassionate and firm. "We all make mistakes, Daniel. What matters is whether you have the courage to stand up and change. But first, you must keep your promise." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply until his nerves settled. A strange gratitude washed over him. He realized Brandon had just imparted not only a martial arts lesson, but a profound life lesson. At last, Daniel grasped Brandon's hand, rose shakily to his feet, and turned toward the students, his voice unsteady but sincere. "I want to apologize to all of you. My pride and selfishness turned me into someone who disrespected others and lost sight of the true values of martial arts. I was wrong, and I ask for your forgiveness." The students remained silent, moved beyond words. Their respect for Brandon intensified tenfold. They all knew they'd witnessed far more than a fight. They'd witnessed a powerful lesson in humility, respect, and the true spirit of a warrior. In that solemn quiet, Brandon stepped back, offering the students a gentle, warm smile that nonetheless carried a profound seriousness, as if to remind them that true victory isn't defeating others but mastering ourselves and carrying humility with us through life. The moment Daniel's sincere apology ended, the gym seemed to settle into a profound hush. Every student felt that what they'd just witnessed was more than the close of a fight. It was a priceless lesson in humility and the true value of respecting one another. Brandon remained still, his calm eyes carefully watching Daniel. Before him now stood not a proud fighter using violence to prove his strength, but a man utterly undone, trembling with shame and disappointment so deep that Brandon recognized it immediately, having felt the same agony 20 years ago when he saw his best friend lying motionless on the arena floor. Slowly and gently, Brandon stepped toward Daniel. His eyes shone with genuine empathy, no hint of judgment or disdain. Once more, he extended his hand, his voice soft, but carrying a power greater than any strike he'd ever delivered. "Stand up, Daniel. Today's fight wasn't meant to harm anyone. It was meant to teach all of us something truly important." Daniel looked up at Brandon, his eyes still haunted by shock and grief. His once proud pride lay shattered. Yet, when he met Brandon's understanding, compassionate gaze, he realized he wasn't a complete failure, at least not in the eyes of the man offering his hand. Mustering his remaining strength, Daniel took Brandon's hand and rose slowly. The gym remained in respectful silence, every student watching the two men on the mat with emotions they couldn't put into words. Brandon looked Daniel in the eye, his tone clear and warm, filled with special gravity. "Daniel, you've learned something vital today. Remember, true strength never comes from arrogance, violence, or making others feel weak. True strength is the ability to understand and respect others, no matter their job, background, or appearance." Brandon's words struck Daniel like waking from a long sleep of selfishness and pride. He stood silently, head bowed, shame and regret flooding his mind. He realized that for years he'd let blind arrogance rule him, forgetting the real meaning of being a martial artist: humility, honor, and above all, respect for others. Brandon laid a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder, his voice soft but still brimming with inner strength. "You might have thought I was just a janitor, and that made it easy to look down on me. But you must remember, every person deserves respect, regardless of their profession or appearance. Our true worth isn't measured by titles or outward appearances, but by how we treat others and ourselves." At Brandon's words, every student in the gym stood in moving silence. They felt the profound truth in his message. Emily Chen, standing quietly nearby, felt tears prick her eyes. For the first time, she understood that real strength isn't in punches or kicks, but in seeing others with compassion and genuine respect. Daniel nodded, feeling a strange relief wash over his heart, replacing his old hate and arrogance. "You're right, Brandon. I've been so wrong. I allowed pride and selfishness to blind me. I never truly understood the real value of martial arts, or what it means to be a decent man." Brandon patted Daniel's shoulder once more, his eyes brightening with satisfaction at seeing his opponent finally grasp the life's greatest lesson. "We all make mistakes. What matters most is what we do afterward, how we learn and change. If you understand that today, then this fight truly meant something." Around them, the atmosphere in the gym shifted perceptibly. The tension and pressure vanished, replaced by warmth, humanity, and understanding. Brandon had not only defeated Daniel in combat, he had triumphed over the arrogance and prejudice that can dwell in every heart. Finally, Brandon turned to address all the students, his voice strong and solemn. "Everyone, I have just one request. Never judge someone based on their job or appearance. Each of us has our own story and unique value. Always treat others with humility and respect, because that is the true power of a human being." The gym listened in reverent silence as Brandon's words echoed like a profound lesson in character and compassion. Daniel stood beside him, feeling for the first time that he had truly learned something far more valuable than any title or victory. And in that solemn stillness, everyone understood. The fight they'd just witnessed was not merely a battle on the mat, but a great lesson in life. The lesson that genuine strength, humility, and respect come from within. The moment Brandon finished his heartfelt words about humility and respect, the entire gym fell into a rare, solemn hush. The students all sensed that what they'd just witnessed was more than the end of a martial arts match. It was a priceless lesson in humility and the true meaning of respecting others. In that charged atmosphere, Emily Chen took a deep breath and stepped forward from the crowd, her young eyes now shining with determination and admiration. Clutching her phone in both hands, she made her way to the center of the gym, her voice trembling with courage and sincerity. "Everyone," she began, looking straight at Brandon, "I don't think any of us fully understand just how extraordinary this man is. Brandon Lewis is not an ordinary guy, and he's definitely more than just a janitor." The students murmured among themselves, curiosity flickering in their eyes as they waited for Emily to continue. Daniel Mitchell stood off to the side, his heart pounding with fear and shame. He dared not meet anyone's gaze, because deep inside he already knew that what Emily was about to reveal would spell the end of the reputation and status he had built on arrogance and vanity. Raising her phone high so everyone could see the screen, Emily spoke clearly and earnestly. "Brandon Lewis is a former MMA legend known as the Silent Storm. He won 5 consecutive world championships and is regarded as one of the greatest fighters in MMA history. I just looked him up online, and I think every one of us here deserves to know the truth." The gym sank into profound silence once more. The students exchanged astonished, moved glances. Their curiosity had turned into genuine respect and awe for a man who'd chosen to live quietly and humbly after a painful past. A young male student suddenly spoke up, his voice ringing with emotion. "Brandon, would you consider becoming our coach? We really want to learn from you, not just fighting techniques, but the true spirit of martial arts that you just taught us." His request was met with enthusiastic agreement from the others. One by one, they voiced their heartfelt invitations. The gym manager, Stephen Harris, who'd been standing quietly in the corner, saw the expectant looks directed at him. Mr. Harris stepped forward, awe and respect clear on his face. He placed a hand on Brandon's shoulder and spoke with genuine warmth. "Brandon, I sincerely apologize for not recognizing your true value before. If you'll accept, I'd like to offer you the position of head instructor here. I know our students would learn so much from you." Brandon was silent for a moment, then nodded gently, his eyes full of gratitude and humility. "Thank you, Mr. Harris, and thank you all for your trust. If I can help everyone here understand the real value of martial arts and respect, I would be honored to do so." In the corner, Daniel stood motionless, his heart utterly shattered. In a single evening, his arrogance had cost him everything he'd worked so hard to build: his students' respect, his standing in the martial arts community, and, most painfully, his own sense of self-worth. He felt as if a weighty stone pressed down on his chest, each second filling him with ever deeper regret. In the days that followed, the gym underwent a remarkable transformation. Many students who had trained under Daniel began signing up for Brandon's classes instead, not only because of Brandon's legendary reputation, but because of the compassion, humility, and inspiration he brought to every lesson. Brandon's classes buzzed with positive energy, each session doubling as a lesson in character, respect, and the true spirit of martial arts. Meanwhile, Daniel's classes grew steadily emptier. The eyes that once looked up to him with admiration now avoided him, cool and distant. Daniel felt the loss keenly. With each passing class, he recognized more clearly the heavy price his pride had exacted. One late evening, alone in the silent gym, Daniel collapsed onto the mat, pain and remorse crashing over him like a wave. He bowed his head, tears falling as he asked himself why he'd let arrogance steer him into destroying his own career and reputation. He realized that he had, with his own hands, torn apart everything he once held dear, all because he refused to listen to or truly respect others. Sitting there in the still darkness, Daniel vowed to change, not to reclaim his fame or status, but to become a better man, worthy of genuine respect. And though he knew the road ahead would be difficult, he resolved to work day by day to find himself again, to learn how to respect others and, most importantly, to respect himself. Outside the gym door, Brandon watched Daniel from a distance, his gaze full of understanding and compassion. He knew better than anyone how hard real change could be. But he also knew that this was the greatest victory a martial artist could achieve: conquering one's own pride and finding the humility and integrity that define true strength. Standing quietly just outside the darkened room, watching Daniel's bowed figure steeped in deep remorse, Brandon felt an indescribable emotion well up inside him. The sight reminded him of himself many years ago, when he first confronted his own pain, the agony of losing his best friend due to his own loss of control and arrogance. Brandon understood better than anyone the inner torment Daniel was enduring in that moment. A few days later, after formally accepting the gym's offer to become its instructor, Brandon stood before all the students with calm confidence. The room was packed, not only with familiar faces but with curious newcomers eager to see the man known in MMA circles as the Silent Storm. He stood solidly before them, not wearing the swagger of a celebrated fighter, but the genuine humility and sincerity of a teacher. Clearing his throat, he spoke with clarity and depth. "I agree to return as your coach, but I want everyone here to understand something crucial. I'm not back to teach you how to fight or to win through violence. I'm here to teach you something far more valuable: humility, respect, and the spirit of true understanding." The gym fell silent in rapt attention, admiration shining in every student's eyes. Brandon paused, letting his gaze sweep across the faces of the young trainees, then continued in his warm, resolute voice. "Martial arts isn't meant to display power or defeat others. It's the path to conquering ourselves, so that each of us becomes stronger in heart and character." Over the following days, Brandon's classes swelled to record numbers. News of the Silent Storm's return spread rapidly throughout the city, drawing in both longtime fans of his legendary career and newcomers inspired by the story of a champion turned humble instructor. In every session, Brandon not only taught fundamental techniques, but devoted most of the time to sharing profound life lessons about humility and respect. His classes stood in stark contrast to the usual fierce, victory-driven drills. Instead, he guided students in emotional control, calm resilience under pressure, and, above all, the importance of respecting opponents and themselves. Thanks to this unique approach, Brandon's reputation grew even stronger. Parents sent their children to his classes, hoping they'd learn self-defense skills, and, more importantly, the self-confidence and modesty to carry them through life. As for Daniel, in the days immediately after the incident, he disappeared entirely from the gym, lost in despair and guilt. But when he heard of the profound, positive impact Brandon was having on the younger generation, he realized he still had a chance to rebuild his life. Not by proving physical prowess or chasing titles, but by confronting himself and learning to live with humility and respect. One evening, Daniel returned to the gym doorway. Quietly observing one of Brandon's classes from a distance, he felt a strange surge of emotion as he watched the students hang on every word of the man he'd once scorned. In that moment, Daniel understood that Brandon was not only healing his own past wounds, but also inspiring everyone around him. Noticing Daniel's presence, Brandon stepped over and stood beside him, free of any resentment or judgment. "Daniel," he said softly, "I'm glad you came back. Facing our mistakes and learning to stand up again is the most important first step in each of our journeys." Daniel was silent for a long moment, then spoke in a trembling voice. "I lost everything to my own pride and selfishness, Brandon. I don't know if I'll ever earn anyone's trust again." Brandon placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, his voice warm and encouraging. "The most important thing is not winning others' trust right away, but believing in yourself first. People will notice your change through your actions, not your words. Start with small steps." Brandon's words ignited a spark of hope in Daniel's heart. From that day on, Daniel resolved to change little by little, learning humility and respect for those around him. In the weeks that followed, the gym experienced an emotional rebirth. Students came not just for martial arts, but to hear Brandon's inspiring life stories. They saw in him a living symbol of humility and compassion, a man who had once had everything, lost it all, and now helped the next generation discover the true meaning of strength. Through teaching and sharing, Brandon himself began to heal the old scars in his soul. He realized that the best way to overcome his own pain was to help others avoid the same mistakes. In doing so, he was slowly reborn, not as the MMA legend of old, but as an ordinary man filled with humility, dedicating himself to inspiring and uplifting those around him. The resurrection of the Silent Storm was no longer about titles or past championships. It was about a deeply human return, spreading the most important message of all, that true power never comes from violence, but from humility, respect, and the capacity to forgive others and ourselves. 3 months flew by since Brandon officially stepped into his role as head coach at the gym. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the large windows, the training floor buzzed with eager young students. The atmosphere had completely transformed. Not a trace of the tension and pressure that once came with win-or-lose battles, but instead a relaxed, friendly vibe pulsing with positive energy. With his calm humility, Brandon had become the very heart and soul of the place. Students didn't just come to practice martial arts, they came to listen, to learn how to live with humility, to develop empathy, and to treat everyone around them with respect. To them, every word Brandon spoke was a lesson rich with meaning, and every training session left them feeling at peace and more confident in themselves. Word of the gym's new spirit spread quickly, drawing in newcomers from all walks of life, from grade schoolers and college students to families enrolling their kids not just for physical fitness, but for character building as well. Parents trusted Brandon's patience and compassion. They saw shy children blossom into self-assured young people who cared about and respected others. While Brandon was becoming the community's inspirational figure, across town Daniel Mitchell was starting over in a much smaller, more modest gym. It wasn't crowded or famous like before, and for the first time in his life, Daniel didn't mind one bit. Early on, Daniel felt lonely and ashamed whenever he thought about the glory he'd lost. He replayed his own mistakes, the arrogant words and actions that had cost him everyone's trust and respect. But thanks to Brandon's heartfelt teachings, Daniel gradually realized that fame, success, and admiration are never sustainable without humility and respect. In that little gym, Daniel rebuilt himself from the ground up, quietly teaching his students the basic techniques he once overlooked. This time, though, he didn't just focus on fighting skills. He also learned how to open up, share his experiences, and speak honestly from the heart. Day by day, Daniel felt the change within himself. He grew calmer, he listened more, and most importantly, he learned to treat others with genuine kindness and respect. One afternoon, just as Daniel was about to wrap up class, he looked up in surprise to see Brandon standing at his gym's doorway with a warm, genuine smile. Daniel hurried over, a mix of excitement and nerves on his face. "Brandon, what are you doing here?" Daniel asked softly, a hint of bashfulness in his eyes. Brandon placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his gaze full of understanding. "I just wanted to see how you've been doing. I've heard great things about you, Daniel. You're doing wonderfully, and I'm proud of how far you've come." Daniel looked down, deeply moved by Brandon's sincerity. He nodded, his voice trembling slightly. "It's all thanks to you, Brandon. If it weren't for you, I probably would have never recognized my own mistakes." Brandon shook his head with a gentle smile. "No, it wasn't me. It was you. You chose to change. You had the courage to face yourself. That's what really matters." They stood in silence for a long moment, looking at each other with profound empathy. In that instant, Daniel truly grasped the meaning of Brandon's favorite lesson. The greatest victory isn't defeating an opponent, it's overcoming yourself. A year later, both gyms were thriving in their own ways, united by the same spirit of humility, respect, and understanding. Daniel, no longer the superstar he once was, felt happier and more at peace than ever, knowing he'd discovered true value in his life. As for Brandon, he continued to inspire everyone around him. Every time he stood before his students, he gently reminded them of the lesson he'd spent his life learning and was now devoted to passing on to the next generation. Always remember, the greatest victory isn't defeating someone else, it's conquering yourself. We all face our own challenges, mistakes, and wounds from the past. But the most important thing is to have the courage to rise up, to stay humble, and to live with respect for others. The gym would erupt in applause, students' hearts brimming with renewed hope and faith after every class. To them, Brandon wasn't just a martial arts legend risen from obscurity. He was the living embodiment of true victory, the triumph of compassion, forgiveness, and noble character. And so, a story that began with provocation, discrimination, and pride ends with humility, respect, and the real power of martial arts spirit. A victory not on the mat, but the deepest victory of all, the victory of character. Dear friends, the journey of Brandon Lewis, from humble janitor to martial arts legend, has shown us that true strength isn't in defeating others, but in overcoming ourselves. Life will always present challenges, but do you have the courage to face them and change, just as Brandon did? What do you think about Brandon's inspiring journey? Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share this video with your loved ones, and subscribe to our channel to discover more uplifting stories. See you next time.